I spent months meticulously mapping out the anatomy of my husband's destruction, planning to harvest his future to pay for the past he gambled away. But when armed men kicked down my basement door, I realized I wasn't just a surgeon anymore. I was a target in a war I never meant to start. The velvet box was supposed to hold the promise of forever. It was an antique, a 1920s cushion-cut diamond that had belonged to my grandmother, a piece of jewelry that had survived the Blitz and 3 generations of heartbreak. When I opened the drawer this morning, expecting to see the soft blue felt, all I found was a thick layer of dust and a mocking, hollow silence. David hadn't just taken it, he'd liquidated it. I didn't need a detective to tell me where it went. I knew his haunts. I knew the way he smelled like stale cigarettes and desperation after a long night at the tables. By noon, I was standing outside the Rusty Spade, a basement dive that smelled of damp concrete and broken dreams. I didn't storm in. I didn't scream. I simply waited. When David stumbled out, his face pale and his eyes darting like a trapped bird, I was already there, leaning against his sedan. He looked at me, and for a split second, I saw his entire internal structure collapse. He started stammering, some pathetic lie about a sure thing and triple the investment. But I didn't hear the words. I only heard the sound of my grandmother's legacy being traded for a stack of plastic chips. As he reached out to grab my arm, trying to pull me into the car to explain everything, I felt a cold, jagged certainty harden in my gut. He thought this was just another debt he could negotiate his way out of. He had no idea that I had already stopped looking for the ring. I went home and cleared out my pantry. I stopped eating. I started reading. My degree in surgical technology had been gathering dust for 5 years, a career I'd abandoned to be the supportive wife of a man who viewed my life as his personal collateral. I pulled the medical textbooks from the top shelf of the closet, the ones I thought I'd never need again. I began to map out the anatomy of a monster. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about balance. If he wanted to sell pieces of my past to fuel his addiction, I would balance the scales by taking a piece of his future. I watched him sleep that night, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rhythmic wheezes, completely oblivious to the fact that his biological inventory was being audited. I carefully prepped the basement, moving the heavy shelving units, laying down plastic sheeting that shimmered under the dim light of a single bare bulb. Every movement was precise, calculated, and devoid of tremor. I was no longer a wife. I was a surgeon, preparing for a very specific, very necessary extraction. 3 days later, I told him I'd forgiven him. I cooked his favorite meal, a thick steak with a red wine reduction, and I poured him a glass of the vintage scotch he loved to hoard. He drank it greedily, his eyes already glazing over with the dull intoxication he sought to escape reality. He didn't notice the slight bitterness, nor the way his eyelids began to flutter and heavy. As his head slumped onto the mahogany table with a soft thud, I stood up and locked the kitchen door. I walked over to the closet, reached behind the heavy winter coats, and pulled out the stainless steel medical case I had smuggled home from the hospital surplus auction weeks ago. As I stepped toward him, the heavy thrum of his heartbeat seemed to echo against the walls of the room, a rhythmic timer signaling the end of his autonomy. I reached down and checked his pulse, my fingers cold against his warm, oblivious skin, and whispered into his ear that the settlement had finally arrived. He groaned in his sleep, a low, guttural sound, and shifted his weight. I froze, the scalpel held tightly in my grip, as he suddenly let out a ragged gasp and his eyes snapped wide open, staring directly into mine with a sudden, horrifying flicker of recognition. The flicker of recognition in his eyes was fleeting, quickly swallowed by the chemical fog of the sedative, but it was enough to make my heart stutter. He tried to raise his hand, a sluggish, clumsy movement, but his arm hit the table with the dead weight of a lead pipe. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the cloth soaked in the remaining tincture over his nose and mouth, holding it firmly until the frantic, shallow gasps turned into deep, rhythmic snores. My hands were steady, a professional grace that surprised even me. I moved with the clinical detachment I had mastered years ago in the theater, treating him not as my husband, but as a biological specimen awaiting processing. I dragged him to the basement. The plastic sheeting crunched beneath his heels, a sound that amplified the silence of the house. I had spent hours calibrating the temperature, setting up the portable monitors, and ensuring the lighting was optimal for a delicate procedure. I strapped him to the table, using heavy-duty nylon ties that bit into his wrists. As I stood over him, the hum of the portable ventilator I'd managed to rent from a medical supply house filled the room. It was the only sound, a mechanical pulse replacing the one he was about to lose. I peeled back his shirt, exposing the soft, vulnerable skin of his torso. I felt no hesitation, no residual flicker of the love I once held for him. That woman had died the moment he gambled away my grandmother's diamond, the last physical anchor I had to my sanity. I began the prep. The antiseptic sting of the solution as I wiped down his abdomen felt like an act of cleansing. I wasn't just removing an organ, I was pruning a rot. As I traced the line where the primary incision would start, a sudden sharp vibration shook the room. My phone, tucked into my apron, buzzed relentlessly. I ignored it, focused entirely on the topography of his veins. It buzzed again, then again, a frantic, rhythmic sequence. I glanced down. It was a text from an unknown number. He didn't just gamble the ring, Claire. He gambled the house. The men are coming for the collateral tonight. They don't care about his liver. They just want a body. My breath hitched. The front door alarm, a secondary system I had installed for his safety months ago, suddenly shrieked. It wasn't a glitch. The heavy thud of boots hit the porch upstairs, followed by the splintering crack of the deadbolt giving way under brute force. Someone was in the hallway. I looked down at David, his chest rising and falling in its artificial, drugged rhythm, then up at the basement door. The footsteps were heavy, purposeful, and getting closer. I had the scalpel in my hand, the skin of his abdomen already marked, and my entire plan teetering on the edge of a violent intervention. The basement door handle began to rattle, slowly, testing the lock. I stood in the dark, the surgeon's blade glinting under the harsh light, realizing that I wasn't just going to be an organ harvester tonight. I was going to be a combatant. I turned off the light, plunging the room into absolute suffocating darkness, just as the basement door hinges groaned under a massive, forceful shove. The lock snapped, and a beam of tactical light cut through the gloom, sweeping the room and stopping dead on the table where David lay, his chest exposed and marked for the butcher's knife. A gravelly voice echoed from the top of the stairs. "Found him. And looks like someone beat us to the surgery." The beam of light danced across the cold concrete, catching the glint of my surgical tray before snapping toward me. I flattened myself against the shadows, my back pressing hard into the furnace casing. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands remained deathly still. They hadn't seen me yet, only the table, the plastic, and the sedated, prepped body of the man who had destroyed my life. "Check the corners," the voice growled, rough like grinding stones. Two figures descended the stairs, their boots heavy and deliberate. They were men of business, the kind who didn't deal in chips and cards, but in broken fingers and absolute finality. One of them, a mountain of a man with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, walked directly toward the table. He leaned over David, shining his light into my husband's dilated pupils. "He's under. Someone did the heavy lifting for us." I watched them from the periphery, my fingers tightening around the handle of the scalpel. If they took him now, they'd find the marks. They'd see the prep work. They'd realize that someone had been seconds away from gutting their asset. I wasn't just a jilted wife anymore. I was a loose end in a very dangerous equation. "Find whoever's hiding," the second man muttered, moving toward the wall of shelves where I stood. Nobody leaves a job half-finished unless they're still in the building. I held my breath, the air in my lungs turning to lead. As he stepped closer, his boot toe brushed the edge of the plastic sheeting I had meticulously laid down. He stopped, peering down at the red-stained antiseptic markers on David's skin. A slow, cruel grin spread across his face. Well, well, we've got ourselves an amateur surgeon.
Someone wanted to get paid in biology, huh? He laughed, a wet, hollow sound, and began to move the shelves aside. I knew I had one chance. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the canister of pressurized oxygen I'd stashed behind the cooling unit for the procedure. I kicked the canister valve open just as he rounded the corner, the high-pitched hiss filling the small, enclosed space. It was enough of a distraction. As he instinctively recoiled from the sudden noise, I lunged, not for his throat, but for the light. I smashed the industrial bulb with a heavy wrench. The room plunged into total, blinding darkness. Chaos erupted. The men shouted, their tactical lights swinging wildly, hitting walls and ceiling, illuminating nothing but dust and shadows. I moved with the precision of a ghost, sliding between the crates, my feet silent on the concrete. I circled back toward the table. The scarred man was fumbling for his weapon, cursing as he tripped over the surgical stand. I could hear David's rhythmic, mechanical breathing, the only life left in this room. I reached out, my hand finding the heavy surgical saw I had placed on the corner of the table. In the dark, I couldn't tell who was who, but I could hear the shift of fabric and the heavy draw of a pistol. I didn't think. I swung the heavy steel toward where the man's voice had last echoed. A sickening crunch resonated through the basement, followed by a choked, wet gurgle that silenced the room instantly. The other man froze. The beam of his light flickered on, cutting through the dark, and landed directly on the spot where I stood. He wasn't looking at me, though. He was looking at the table. His eyes widened, his jaw dropping in genuine, frantic horror. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What did you do to his insides?" I looked down. In the darkness, I had missed my mark in the struggle, but I hadn't missed the reality of the situation. The man on the table wasn't just sedated anymore. A dark, viscous stain was spreading rapidly across the plastic sheets, and his monitors were emitting a long, steady, soul-crushing tone. But it wasn't the death that made the man with the flashlight drop his gun. It was the fact that as I turned to face him, the blood from the table had splashed across my face, and from the top of the stairs, a third person began to descend. Someone I recognized instantly as the person I had paid to help me finish this, holding a silenced pistol aimed directly at my back. The air in the basement turned frigid, the kind of cold that crawls into your marrow. I didn't turn around. I knew the silhouette at the top of the stairs, Dr. Aris, the man I'd hired to assist with the extraction. He was supposed to be my silent partner, the one who would ensure the liver was harvested and transported to the buyer waiting in the city. He wasn't supposed to be working with the men who had come to claim the house. "The deal changed, Claire," Aris said, his voice smooth and detached, echoing off the concrete walls. He started down the stairs, his movements as fluid as oil. "The debt David owed these gentlemen was astronomical. It's far more profitable to let them take the collateral in full than to butcher it for parts." The man with the flashlight, still reeling from the sight of the cooling corpse on the table, looked between me and Aris. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just here to collect a debt. He was here to be the cleaner. Aris didn't hesitate. He raised the silenced pistol and fired. The man dropped without a sound, a neat hole in his forehead. I stood in the center of the room, my hands stained crimson, the surgical saw still dangling from my grip. I looked down at David. The irony was suffocating. I had wanted to take a piece of him to settle the score, but in the chaos, I had inadvertently turned his final moments into a war zone. "You're a disappointment, Claire," Aris sighed, checking the chamber of his weapon as he stepped over the body of the hitman. "You had such a meticulous plan, such precision,
But you forgot the most important rule of the underworld. Never hire an accomplice who owes more than you do. He stepped into the ring of light, the barrel of his gun leveled at my chest. He was waiting for me to beg. He was waiting for the tears, the realization of my own mortality, the breakdown of the woman who thought she could play surgeon in a world of butchers. I looked him in the eye and felt a strange, terrifying calm wash over me. I hadn't come this far and lost this much to die on a basement floor because of a double cross. My hand, resting near the edge of the surgical table, found the heavy, pressurized tank of anesthetic gas I had rigged earlier. I hadn't just prepped David. I had prepped the entire room. "You're right, Eris," I said, my voice steady, almost a whisper. "I should have known better." With a sudden, violent shove, I tipped the surgical table, sending David's body sliding into Eris. It was a clumsy, desperate distraction, but it worked. As Eris recoiled, firing a shot into the ceiling, I yanked the release valve on the gas tank. A thick, opaque cloud of chemical fog exploded into the room, obscuring everything in a matter of seconds. He coughed, the sound wet and frantic. I didn't move toward the door. I moved toward the shadows behind the furnace, where I had stashed the only thing that mattered. I didn't care about the money or the revenge anymore. I grabbed my bag, the one containing my passport, the cash I'd scraped together, and the small, tarnished locket I'd managed to recover from David's coat pocket before he'd passed out. I slipped through the crawl space, the narrow vent I'd spent 2 days widening, and emerged into the cool, biting night air of the backyard. Behind me, the basement exploded into a symphony of confusion, shouts, heavy footsteps, and then the sound of Eris firing blindly into the darkness. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the life that had been systematically dismantled, piece by piece. I walked into the tree line, my boots crunching on the dead leaves, leaving the debt, the blood, and the monster behind me. By the time the sirens started to wail in the distance, I was already miles away. The weight of the locket against my chest, the only thing left of the woman I used to be. The ring was gone, the husband was dead, and I was, for the first time in my life, completely, terrifyingly free.